So up next, I have with us Ben Balter. He is speaking to us remotely from Washington. Ben currently works at GitHub as the government evangelist and also works extensively with the GitHub Pages team. Ben has previously worked at the highest levels of government in the US, including the Office of the Managing Director of the FCC and the Executive Office of the President for the US Chief Information Officer. He's a Juris Doctor with publications to his name, and he also holds an MBA. I was actually lucky enough to meet Ben in person recently at the Open Source Open Society Conference in Wellington, New Zealand, and he won the heart of the crowd there with his fast-speaking style and his fast wit to match. Ben blogs extensively about open source, open government, and Jekyll at benbalter.com, and we're lucky enough to have him with us today.
Maybe, can you see me?
Yeah, we can.
How's everyone doing today?
Awesome.
Very, very excited to be here. I'm a big fan of Jekyll. I've been using Jekyll for about 2 years now, and anyone that could potentially listen, I've been talking to them about Jekyll and how much I like it, and how awesome I think GitHub Pages as a service. And so hoping to talk a little bit today just about my journey through discovering Jekyll, why I'm passionate about Jekyll, and then take a look back at kind of the evolution and the relationship between Jekyll and GitHub Pages, and kind of all the things that go around Jekyll in order to make Jekyll a really great experience for a large community. So with that, hopefully, these things actually often work right up until you actually need them, but hopefully you should be able to see my slides. Yes? Holler if that's not the case.
Slides are up. Excellent.
Awesome. Sweet. Taking a look at kind of GitHub Pages behind the scenes, and a little-known open-source project called Autoblog that I'm looking forward to talking about today. So that's me, at Ben Balter. Prior to the Jekyll world and kind of where we start our story today, I used to be a big fan of WordPress. I was a WordPress core contributor. I did Google Summer of Code. I actually made a Google Summer Code project called WordPress Document Revisions, WP Document Revisions, that basically took WordPress and made it into a document management system as well. And I thought WordPress was the best thing since sliced bread. If you ever saw that XKCD comic that when all you have is a pair of bolt cutters, everything looks like the lock on Wolf Blitzer's boathouse. For me, that was WordPress. I really thought there wasn't anything that you couldn't do with WordPress and wasn't any problem that WordPress couldn't solve. And so very well, unbeknownst to my knowledge, Tom came along and he created in October 2008, created something. This was the first commit of what was then known as actually Autoblog. It wasn't known as Jekyll for quite some time, and I had no idea that this was going on. I still thought that WordPress was the best thing since sliced bread, and so that was like I said, October 2008. Or 2 months later, by November, we got our first name change. Jekyll was already known as Conveyor. It's really interesting. I was going through, as I was preparing for this, just going through the commit history and going through kind of the history of the project. I think it really tells a lot about where things have gone, where things have come from, and where things we might be going. And the one thing I noticed is that this was authored on November 17th, 2008, when it was renamed to Conveyor. And then just a couple hours later, it was already renamed to Jekyll. So the classic, hardest thing in computer science is cache invalidation and naming things. But Jekyll landed, and about a month after that, in December, Pages launched. So for those that aren't aware, GitHub Pages is a hosted version of Jekyll. Anytime you push to any repository on GitHub, it just magically runs Jekyll in the background, and your generated content from your repository gets hosted out to the world. It was originally just made for software document. It was originally GitHub Pages was originally made for software documentation and to give people places to talk about their open source work, whether it's their personal website, their organizational website, or website for a particular project. And so, like I said, that was at the beginning of December. That was December 18th. No less than 11 days later. I wasn't there, but they're just reading through the blog. There must have been a feature request. Already there was the ability to disable Jekyll. So I don't know why people would do that, but you can see that there's kind of the way that Jekyll came about. We started adding CNAME support for it, started adding configuration files. And by April 2009, there were 3,000 GitHub Pages sites, which PJ commented on the blog post that day that he didn't think that Chris and Tom and the team that put Jekyll and GitHub Pages together didn't think that 3,000 people would be even building their site on Jekyll and GitHub Pages. And so we'll see towards the end of the talk just how far things have come and just how much things have changed. So like I said, that was me in 2008, having no idea what Jekyll was, and just being fully blissful in my ignorance. So fast forward to 2012, a buddy of mine, Dave Cole, who at the time was working for a company called Development Seed and now works for 18F, kind of the technology startup within the General Services Administration, publishes a blog post on their company blog called How We Build CMS-Free Websites. If you Google it, it's a really, really great read, but it really kind of blew my mind, right? I was in this place where I thought WordPress was the best thing in the world. And he lays out this argument for that it's really not the smartest way to build content, right? You have this giant Rube Goldberg machine that every time a user visits your site, you have a front-end server that fires PHP that hits a back-end database that has to pull the content. You get this content, you then generate it, you mangle it into a template, and you're building this kind of bespoke website every time that someone's requesting a page, regardless of if the content is changed or not, right? You have all these disparate systems and all these different parts and so many different points of failure. But then he gets to this conclusion that I thought was very interesting. He says the lingua franca of the internet is three things. It's HTML, it's CSS, and it's JavaScript. That's the only three things that web browsers can understand and the only three things that websites ever put out. You don't need all this complexity. You don't need all these points of failure. You don't need this giant Rube Goldberg machine, even if you want an RSS feed or a JSON API feed. All those are just different types of templates. And this really blew my mind, that things could be this simple. So I had a personal blog that I was using for my own site, so that my mom and my aunt and maybe 2 or 3 other people that possibly cared might have read my random rants in my blog posts. I was on a shared host at the time. That was kind of, in my mind, the best possible way to be running a WordPress site. And over the period of 6 months, I had over 130 outages, not by me doing anything, not really by anyone's fault, just by complexity of the system. And that was more than 24 hours of downtime. So I said, no, this is crazy. I'm going to build myself the best website possible. AWS, Nginx, Microcache, APC, opcode cache, page and object cache. I literally had so many layers of cache on it, like you name the buzzword, and it was part of this stack. And I stood that up, and then I stood up a Jekyll stack alongside it with the same exact content. And the Jekyll stack just kind of blew itself out of the water. So I personally converted my own personal site over to Jekyll, and I was just kind of hooked. And the thing that really did it for me was I discovered the concept of a weekend, right? When you have these very complex systems, there's always tinkering to do. There's always different ways to fix. There's a plugin to write or a module to kind of tweak. And with Jekyll, the beauty is this Zen-like simplicity, that you just commit your code and it just works. And that's what really stuck for me. So here's the contribution graph for Jekyll. I told this was a Ben Balter-centric history of Autoblog and GitHub Pages. This is, as you can see, if you just go to Jekyll/Jekyll, this is the contribution graph. And right there, right at the end of 2012, is when I started using Jekyll. I'm not saying that there was a correlation between the two of those. That's definitely not my contributions there, but just putting that out now. I'm just joking. I just thought that was very funny. That you can see Jekyll's really, really taken off and has come a really long way from 2008 when there were just 3,000 sites on it, and no one thought that it was actually going to be used. So like I said, I started using Jekyll in October, and as developers do, as soon as you start using something that you love and you like, you find that it's terrible, you find that it doesn't meet your needs, and you want it to do more. So what's that? 5 months after I discovered Jekyll, I'm already finding problems with it. This was the first issue that I opened against Jekyll, and really just showing that Jekyll's the type of platform that as soon as you show it to somebody, if you go through the issue queue, there's just so many things that people want it to do because it's such a malleable platform and can do so many powerful things. So by March, I joined GitHub. And was a Jekyll user at the time, but joined GitHub as we were talking about earlier to do government stuff. Right, my job is to help government agencies that they want to get involved with an open source project. They want to take their first or second step into the open source community, that they're successful and that they have a good experience. And I was just as as one does, GitHub is run very much like an open source project internally, in the sense that you have access to different code bases. You know, it's not, things aren't very walled off. It's a lot of sharing internally, and so of course the first thing I do is I go over to the GitHub Pages code base and actually look how things are put together and how things are wired up. I assumed it was this really, really complicated system that served content out in some really, really awesome way. And I was actually a little bit kind of shocked to see all of GitHub Pages at this time, this was about 2012 or so, was an 87-line shell script. And you can see the relevant piece of it here. It does exactly what you expect it to do. It says, okay, do they want us to run Jekyll? Great. Let's just shell out to the Jekyll command line and grab the content. And I also particularly like that it exits true, no matter if the build worked or not. It always just says log, page build complete, exit true. And so I saw this and I said, okay, that's kind of cool, but you know, GitHub Pages Jekyll isn't my job. It's just kind of something I do on the weekends, something for fun. But developers love scratching itches, right? Developers see things that aren't quite good enough, that aren't quite right. And if you want, you know, help with a project, the best thing you can possibly do is show a developer how to do it the wrong way. So I started going in and just started, as you would when you get involved with an open source project, just started tinkering. I was just learning Ruby at the time, and so submitting very small pull requests to kind of just try to get my feet wet. And just understood how this thing that I've kind of fallen in love with and really had a passion for, how it worked and how it take behind the scenes. And as a result, as it happens with most developers, you discover that you fall down a rabbit hole, that it's not just one or two things that are worth fixing, but you find that there's this whole community out there and really get brought into the community. So I started contributing to Jekyll, and things kind of then took off from there. So I want to talk a little bit about how then, to shift a little bit, to talk a little bit how GitHub Pages works behind the scenes and kind of the interaction between GitHub Pages and Jekyll, now that we kind of have the history of how we got here. Hopefully a little bit to degree of where we're going. So this was May 2013. This is about 6 months after I started. Jekyll 1.0 came out, which was really interesting and really meaningful. All the APIs that we know today, all the kind of functionality that we know and love today, kind of really got their footing then. And it was the Jekyll coming to, in my mind, coming to say, hey, we're a real thing. We're not just this kind of side project that's only really used by one site, but we're a real major thing that's used by campaigns, that's used by government agencies. We're the real deal, and you should trust us, and you should use us accordingly. And so so what I said is that one of the challenges that we see with GitHub Pages is that Jekyll's really awesome, but it is extremely simple and extremely easy to use, which is a double-edged sword, because there are lots of folks that want to use GitHub Pages and that want to use Jekyll and that can't just kind of use it. There's gem files involved, there's RBM, there's different Ruby versions, and then there's all sorts of issues with there's 10, 15 different dependencies. Am I using the right dependency in the right order? Is it, do I have the right version of Cramdown? And so we came up with the idea of producing the GitHub Pages Gem. If you actually look at the code of the GitHub Pages Gem, it's just github.com/github/pages gem. There's really nothing all that remarkable there. There's actually not any code in there. All it is just a programmatic way to generate a gem file and then expose that out. But that all of a sudden means that we have a means to replicate. You take an open source project, you host it as a service, and you add another open source project on top of that in order for you to replicate that service back on your local computer. The idea being there that we wanted to make sure that users could have just as close to an environment on their local machine to test their builds and to see what their build looks like as they could in production. Because it's not like a WordPress site, coming back to my history, where there's only kind of one version. You're running version 1.2.3 of WordPress. With Jekyll, there were so many different dependencies, and again, because it's so simple, a lot of users that might not have as much experience into the Ruby world. And then by October of that year, a light bulb really went off, I think, for me and kind of among the broader community. I myself was working on a government microsite, government.github.com, and we were doing it entirely in Jekyll, because at that point, why would you use anything else, right? Jekyll's the best thing since sliced bread. It's the new WordPress. And what was really interesting is I came up with a really terrible design, the design that you see on the left there, But because the content and the work that we were doing was all in Jekyll, it was all versioned, I started to realize that Jekyll wasn't just a content management system, it wasn't just a static site generator. It fundamentally changed the way that people work on content, work on web content. It forces you to be collaborative not only in the code, but to treat the content with the same respect that geeks treat their code, right? Geeks know that if so much as a single semicolon is off, the entire program will come crashing to a halt. Why not use that same respect, that same methodology that geeks have developed over 20, 30 years to also apply to that image in the sidebar, to the text that you have for the lead or the hero or whatever it might be. And so we iterated on the content, but I also realized a second thing through this, is that the power of Jekyll wasn't just that it forced you to version content as code, but also that there wasn't really much code, right? There's not this whole like plugin that might have a bug that could break or new functionality you need to build out. You essentially just as quickly as possible get your idea into markup, which is pretty common stock for most developers or for most people that are familiar with web design and web development. And then beyond that, it's just templating, right? It's just as quickly as possible trying to get your logic out there. So it really allowed you to focus on the content and put the content front and center, where for me a lot of other kind of site generators, whether they be static or otherwise, focus really on the code and focus on the behind-the-scenes stuff, not on the front end. The last kind of big shift that I want to talk about was going over to Gembased Plugins. So we worked with the Jekyll team to try to really push this idea through, because for us, we wanted to be able to support plugins, but from a security perspective, if you remember the way Jekyll still does lightweight plugins today and did plugins for its entire history, was, hey, just throw arbitrary Ruby file, Ruby code into this file and we'll execute it for you. As a hosted service, that was really, really scary, and we wanted to be able to lock things to different versions, to review the code, and to have a set list of known things that we could use. The other kind of big thing that came out of the Jekyll 1.3 release for us was the idea of the data folder. That came out of a lot of discussions. I mean, there were other motivations, but my passion for that came from a lot of discussions with government agencies that were looking for really, really easy ways to stand up APIs, right? Unlike maybe you or I or your startup, it's really easy for someone who grew up on Ruby, who grew up on PHP, to stand up an API, right? You take the file in, you put it in a database, you spit it out, you're done. For government agencies, that's a lot harder, and when you start getting contractors involved, that can be a multi-million-dollar process. And so instead, just take a CSV file, take a JSON file, throw it in a data folder, and all of a sudden it's now exposed to your site. You can make a RESTful API out of that. You can make a JSON API out of that. Really helped, at least for me, to help evangelize Jekyll and to evangelize GitHub Pages as a data publishing platform. So not only now are we treating content as code, we can also begin to treat data as code and have this platform with 1 or 2 lines of liquid templating to get an XML file, to get a JSON file, to get back whatever we might want without needing to have a computer science degree or a formal computer science background. So as the kind of this theme you're kind of starting to see here is we have Jekyll, which is this really, really great core, which is a really, really great product, or project. But every time you go to use it, you want more, right? You want to get more out of it. You want data files. You want collections. And so the biggest piece of feedback we got was speed. People wanted to use Jekyll for distributing all sorts of cool things, right? Including binaries and all sorts of crazy stuff that they probably should not be using Jekyll for. But that's the cool thing about Jekyll. Jekyll doesn't care what your content is. You just throw it at it. It'll handle it like a champ. So this was January or so of 2014. We started adding a CDN, a content delivery network, in front of it, and started building then tooling to try to bring Jekyll to a broader community. Right? We created pages.github.com, which was at the time just a, hey, like you should use Pages kind of site. We made a tutorial that walks you through the couple clicks, like, hey, this is how you set up your first Jekyll site. Again, really trying to bring the Zen-like simplicity that is Jekyll and expose it to people to get rid of that intimidation factor, because it really is that easy to use, and I think that's where a lot of the power is. So you got Jekyll, you got the CDN, you got an easy way to use it, and you got the Gems version locally. The problem with all this is through most of GitHub Pages history, it was a black box, right? So I would leave out, going back to the idea, I would leave out 1 curly bracket. I would leave out 1 semicolon. I would typo the name of a field or something, and the entire page would come crashing to a halt, as things do with software. For the longest time, there was nothing we could really do about that. We just said, sorry, your page build failed. That sucks. And so the biggest piece of feedback we got was that people wanted feedback on their builds, and so it was a significant engineering effort in order to do that. in a really kind of secure way that our security team was happy with, but also that was a great user experience, right? Just getting back the Jekyll error for us wasn't really good enough, right? That if I'm new to Jekyll and I get back, unclosed tag, I have no idea what that means, and so we also did an effort to make sure that every single next slide over. We make sure that every single error message had its own kind of out and had its own URL and was really documented, because people might not realize this. A big part of our support effort of GitHub Pages is supporting Jekyll, right? Lots of first-time users come, and we're kind of, in many ways, kind of that mentor, that tutorial, that kind of big brother or big sister to help people out build the first Pages site or the Jekyll site, or even to do some really complicated stuff or debug some issues. If you go through the issue queue for Jekyll, you'll find a lot of really, really great edge cases. I love bugging Parker with really, really complicated problems that as a developer you think would never come up, but when you have the kind of scale that GitHub Pages has, you get to unclose some of those bugs pretty quickly, and some of them are pretty fun to try to track down. By February, the idea was we wanted to bring a little bit more of the GitHub experience to Jekyll. So we had plugins. We had Gemified plugins that we could version. We said, hey, let's go ahead and turn them on for users. So we started doing things like adding in repository metadata, where if people were using Jekyll to build documentation for their project site, for their open source project, like the Jekyll site itself, or if they're using it to showcase their organization's open source efforts, we wanted to make it easier for them to do that. So we injected metadata about their activity on GitHub directly into the site.github namespace, and also added things like emojis and redirects and at mentions, and kind of brought a little bit of GitHub experience back to Jekyll. The two projects are separate. It's just an open source project, but we obviously are big fans of it and wanted to give back where we could. So the first iteration of Jekyll or GitHub Pages was that 100-line shell script. There was a second iteration that kind of happened in the background of all those things that I just talked about, where actually the entire backend was rewritten as a fully fledged OAuth Ruby app. If you go right now into your OAuth settings on GitHub, you'll actually see a GitHub Pages app in there. Everything works outside, for the most part, is in a way that can work outside the firewall. We use front-facing cloning endpoints. We actually go back and hit the GitHub API. I'll talk about the architecture in a moment. So that was kind of Pages 2.0 for us, or 3.0, depending on which way you look at it. And the last kind of iteration that really pushed us over the edge, and I think made it to get Jekyll and GitHub Pages into a really solid place. In June, we moved to Docker. We created an open source project called Who's Go, where we're using a couple different apps at GitHub, but every time that a build is created with Jekyll, we actually, we create a ephemeral Docker jail, so that we know that you have a clean environment, that your environmental variables are set the way that you expect, and we can kind of version that and have the server exactly as pristine as you'd like it. We build your project, and we just tear down the server and start with a brand new Docker build on the next brand new Docker instance on the next build that comes through. In addition to kind of having a pristine build environment, that helps us sandbox things a little bit and allowed us to move a little bit faster. So if you've noticed, at least more recently, the update speed of GitHub Pages should hopefully be a little bit closer in line with the Jekyll kind of head and the Jekyll master, because then we're able to integrate those things a little more quickly, a little more confidence, because we have lots of things that people trust and can't move quite as quickly as, maybe you can use the beta version on your local machine, but that would be a little bit, irresponsible for a hosted service to do. Like I said, we did the docs refresh, where we pointed out to augment the Jekyll documentation and point to it where we could. Hey, you're getting this error message from Jekyll. Here's the documentation in Jekyll. Maybe here's an open issue that describes how to solve that. Again, just kind of being that first line of support for GitHub Pages and to support the Jekyll community as much as we possibly could. The last kind of big iteration that I think really brought Jekyll into where it is today was the launch of Jekyll 2.0. We skipped Jekyll 2.0. There's a couple complications there, but jumped on the ship with Jekyll 2.2, which brought in things like Sass and CoffeeScript. It moved to Cramdown as the new default engine. If you ever used Maruku, one of the worst features of that from a support perspective is that anytime anything was even remotely wrong, the entire site just didn't build, and it wasn't really super great at lots of different edge cases around Markdown. Collections, obviously, that brought Jekyll out of just being a blogging engine, out of just being a simple site generator, and really allows you to do all sorts of cool things with it, from puppies in a kennel to cars in a parking lot, or whatever you might want to possibly render or version with it. And so that really, at least internally at GitHub, people started taking Jekyll and started taking GitHub Pages seriously. Especially with the native Sass and CoffeeScript support, a lot of designers, a lot of front-end developers, it caused their ears to perk up a little bit, and they said, whoa, wait a minute, this Jekyll thing, this is now a real thing. For someone that grew up on asset pipeline, that grew up on Rails, and that's kind of their understanding of the way to build websites, to have a simpler version of that experience that just kind of works without any real behind-the-scene magics, but doing exactly what you ask for, no more, no less. That was really powerful, and I think that really helped get a lot of people in GitHub really excited about Jekyll and really excited about supporting GitHub Pages. And I'll talk about how we moved a bunch of things over. The last thing underlying this is to point out is Jekyll gets to move really quickly, which I'm really jealous about. Because Jekyll's an open source project. It's semantically versioned, right? If I'm on version 1.9.0 and there's a big breaking change, you put that out in 2.0, and I can upgrade on that at my leisure. I make sure it works locally. I can test that on my own time. When you have a hosted product, it's really hard to move that quickly. People don't like it when they just push, a simple typo fix and someone else messed with their stuff, someone else broke their stuff. So the challenge for us has really been to maintain as much backwards compatibility as possible, and where we can't, to make the user experience as good for users as possible. I think a lot of Jekyll is built for power users in the sense that, and when I say power users, people that will run it locally and that can debug a gem file or something like that and can understand semantic version to a certain degree. A lot of our users are in a very good way, are first-time Jekyll users, and so that it's kind of an honor and a burden to as much as possible try to level up the Jekyll experience and then transition from burden to burden. Lessen the burden from version to version. So the transition from Cramdown to Maruku is a really great example of that, where every time a user had pushed to their site for about 6 months or so, if they were using Cramdown, if we detected that was the engine, whether they set it or that was they used Maruku, if they set it or if that's what it defaulted to, just send them a nice email. Let them know that Cramdown is the new thing and that Markdown is going the way of the Dodo, or Maruku is going the way of the Dodo. Cramdown is the new awesomeness, and then they should make the switch as soon as they can, which we got some really great feedback about. We open source a little bit more of our stack. We open source what we call Pages Health Check, which ran some DNS checks around the configuration. Again, the idea of Jekyll being the core of everything we do, and then putting little things around the edges of it just to make the experience a little bit easier and a little bit more robust, so that you can run locally to check to make sure your DNS works, and that's actually what we use behind the scenes. It's the same exact code that we use for support and the same exact code that we fire every time we build your site for you to make sure that your DNS is right. Otherwise, we send you a polite little, hey, maybe you should check this out and clean this up. The last kind of thing that really brought things home for Jekyll was in January of this year, GitHub Help, help.github.com, our largest and most trafficked site after github.com itself, where we host all the repositories, actually moved over to Jekyll. And GitHub Pages. It was a very complex Rails app, which was really hard to maintain. We had lots of scaling issues around search, around if there was a big push of traffic, DDoS issues. We just kept adding more and more complexity, going back to that kind of argument that I had from the Dave Cole Development Seed blog post at the top of the talk. And we said, hey, we don't need all this pain. This is all static content. It only changes when we change it, when we draft a new help document and when we draft a new release. Let's move this all to Jekyll. Let's move this all to GitHub Pages. Eat a little bit of our own dog food, or drink your own champagne, or eat your own ice cream, depending on which metaphor you follow. And let's kind of level up the product. And any feature that GitHub Pages doesn't have, any feature that Jekyll doesn't have that we want, let's go ahead and build it. Let's open source it. Let's give it to our users, and let's make the product better. And I think it is as a result. Oh, why did I just drop out? Is that working? There we go. Let's try that. Did I skip a page? Awesome, sweet. So the last thing I want to leave you with, and I have a couple of just stats to talk about, and then I'll open it up for questions, is just talk a little bit about the actual architecture. It's actually deceivingly simple, even with all this kind of functionality that we've buttoned on top of it. Basically, when you push your site, GitHub.com calls out to a GitHub Pages worker. That Pages worker essentially has a wrap around it that just fires Jekyll. The site is built on the worker, and then it's sent over to a file server. That's essentially all the GitHub Pages stack was from 2008 when it launched in December of 2008, all the way up until, let's say, about 6 months to a year ago. We've added some complexity on top of that. We now have front-end servers that sit in front of all that. If you recall back in the history of GitHub Pages, it used to be when you'd push a change, there'd be about a 10-minute lag between when you'd push and when you would actually see the change. We got that down by purging the CDN cache. But then the other issue is when you set up a new site, when you changed your DNS settings, it would take a while for that to build. That was because we were generating giant Nginx files every time someone pushed a new CNAME to their site or created a new site. And that obviously doesn't scale when you get at the kind of scale that GitHub Pages is using. So we now have a front-end server that sits in front of the file servers that have a Go plugin for Node that actually hit a MySQL database that check the CNAME routes that are given to it from .com and then just proxy it over to the file server. So if you actually create a new GitHub Pages site today, I don't know the exact number, but it should be in the ballpark of seconds rather than in 5 to 10 minutes as was expected before. So basically the first line is exactly what it is. We just added one more layer on top of that in terms of the CDN and in terms of the front end server to help with routing a little bit. But essentially a 6-year-old product that hasn't really changed since its conception. So here, just to round things out, this is a graph of GitHub Pages sites over time. As you can see, there's the 3,000 or so that we saw when about 6 months after the product was launched, and today we're doing about 750,000 GitHub Pages sites that we host now. Traffic-wise, it's probably about 250,000 hits a minute. And I don't know the exact bandwidth number off the top of my head, but a significant amount of bandwidth as well. It's a very popular service, but that only tells half the story, right? The idea of someone creating a site, the idea of someone visiting a page that you might be just kind of set it and forget it sort of deal. And so the metric that I really like looking at is the number of GitHub page builds per day. So as you can see, in 2012, we were doing about 2,500 page builds per day, successful builds per day, and now we're doing in the ballpark of 20,000 successful builds per day, with the number of errored builds, with all this kind of tooling, this documentation, this feedback that we're putting in there, decreasing the number of Jekyll errors that are generated, and then that blue line there being the warnings that are generated for things like DNS, for things like deprecation and stuff like that. Just kind of pointing a little bit to the future, this is really cool for me. Being a government person and being someone passionate about Jekyll, this was the vision that I really saw when I did the government site and when I read Dave's blog post, and I think is really the future of where Jekyll has a lot of potential. So this came out this week. This is the FITARA guidance from the Office of Management and Government. This is White House policy. White House policy that is written in Jekyll as just a markdown file, committed to GitHub Pages that anyone in the world, you, I, members of government can go, and if you notice at the top of the page there's a big blue edit guidance button that you can click, you can improve the guidance, you can actually submit pull requests to change White House policy, and Jekyll makes that all possible. So what I talked about today is really a deep dive on some of the blog posts that came out earlier this week on the GitHub blog. If you go to github.com/blog, you can grab it, or that's kind of the short link to go directly to it, or just Google 8 lessons learned hacking on GitHub Pages for 6 months. Everything that I talked about today from when I joined GitHub on have really been just a small kind of project of passion from a small group of Jekyll users internally that really kind of make the case for Jekyll, for GitHub Pages, and really see its potential. I've been trying to push it forward as much as possible. So I really think that Jekyll's really awesome, not just for its ability, as I started out with, using it to publish my own site and my own kind of rants and diary, but also for the potential that it has for enabling other people to publish content collaboratively, and then what that means for the future for different types of content. Maybe we're using it for data, maybe we're using it for policy, maybe we're using it for the best chocolate cookie recipe, whatever that might be. I think Jekyll is a really special place in merging the worlds of open source and merging the world of open content and publishing it out in a human readable and machine readable way, which I think is really exciting. So as you can tell, I'm really passionate about Jekyll. I'm glad to stick around and geek out about it anytime. My contact information is there. Please feel free to hit me up on Twitter or via email if you have any questions, if you have any feature requests for Pages. I'll try to get my copy of my slides online as well and tweet those out if you're interested. But if we have a little bit of time, I can stick around for questions. Otherwise, like I said, I'd love for this to be the start of a conversation, and we're big fans of Jekyll at GitHub, and we'd love for that to continue and to grow over time. So thank you.
Awesome, Ben. Definitely a couple of questions coming in here off the Twitter stream. First one from David Barnes says, are you still working to improve GitHub Pages despite having to fight the security issues with gems?
Oh, yes. So the reason that we did the gems, the reason that we did Docker was so that we could move more quickly. The GitHub security team is awesome, and they're very collaborative. They're in the pull request with us. They're reviewing lines of code, and a lot of it was even the GitHub Pages team pushing back on the process. Rather than just throwing more stuff at the security team, we wanted to find a scalable way that we can build GitHub Pages and maintain GitHub Pages going forward, and so that every release can get out faster than the last, and we can be even more responsive. So doing things like gemified plugins, doing things like moving this to Docker, and some of the back-end stuff that we did to get a little bit more monitoring really helps us be more confident and move more quickly. And also that's extremely helpful to see things like this, to see the bigger Jekyll community. Because if you think back to 2-3 years ago and you look at the Jekyll community then to the Jekyll community now, just the quality of the product, the project itself, has really improved, which really helps us to move things forward. So I would love, I know that, for example, I've heard stories about how WordPress.com, the hosted version of WordPress, just runs WordPress.org, the open source project's head, its master branch. I would love for us to get to a place where we could be the beta tester. Like imagine if Jekyll had 750,000 beta test sites that before the 1.0 got out. Maybe there's some sort of way to opt in to a newer version of Jekyll or something like that, or maybe some sort of a Heroku-like experience where I can specify what version I want. We're not there yet, but I think that's the vision, and that's where I'd love to see us eventually. Cool,
great answer. A very popular question asked by both Martin Gonzalez and Tilo Meyer is custom domain SSL support coming to Pages?
Yes. Well, I'd like it to. I can't speak for that. It's really hard. So it's relatively easy if you have a star.github.io domain to stand up SSL support. If you try to do it right now, it works technically. We don't support it because of some backend issues. We're not confident in the implementation enough to say you should use this, you should support this. We'd like to get to a place let me back into this. So if you would follow the news, we were part of a DDoS a couple weeks ago, and one of the reasons we think that the DDoS came about the way that it was because of SSL, was because of HTTPS. That you can't really track content across the internet when it's encrypted, and I always was of the kind of school of thought that HTTPS was only for things that you wanted to keep secret. GitHub Pages being static content, there's nothing, it's open source, there's nothing really secret to put there. But what I'm realizing increasingly is that HTTPS also keeps things seen. It makes sure that no one else can see what you're doing and can't filter it, and it's a good way to make sure you have the integrity of the content, especially when you start looking at things like policy documents, like the White House is working to collaborate on. It's important. So custom domain, so star.github.io domains are probably going to be the first things that we'll take a pass at, just because they're a little bit easier to do. When you start looking at custom domains, you get into certificate authorities, and we want it to be a good experience for the user. That's where our priority is, and we also want it to be something that's trustworthy. So it's something I'd like to see. It's a path that I'd like to be heading. I can't give any promise on when, but it's definitely on our radar.
Cool.
It's probably one of the biggest feature requests we get.
Excellent. Another question here from David Downs. What features would you personally like to see in GitHub Pages in the future?
What features would I personally like to? Well, besides for SSL support, that would probably be the top of my list. No, the one thing that I really like to see that there are some there's just some engineering challenges involved with it. Is right now we have an automatic page generator. So if you have a GitHub repo with a README in it, so let me back up a second. The way most projects start is you have your code in the project, then you're like, oh wait, humans actually should read this. Let me write some documentation, and you go back and you write a README, and it's just like the title of the project and a couple different lines of how to use some methods. And then as that kind of documentation evolves, I'd love GitHub Pages to grow with the project. I'd love it so that you can just hit a button. And right now we have the automatic site generator, the automatic page generator, which will take that content and put it into a static HTML site that's served by GitHub Pages. But then it kind of leaves you a dead end. There's not a lot that you can do with that. I'd really love for that automatic site generator to generate a Jekyll site, right? Maybe it's the same exact theme that you see content in an index.markdown, have a template over here, and make it so that you have training wheels and you can actually start down the path of Jekyll and edit the site. And then the last kind of phase of that is I'd love all those sites, those templatic sites, to be open source and just Jekyll themes. And maybe there's some sort of Jekyll theme library that's just a GitHub repo or something like that, where people that are passionate about Jekyll can contribute to those themes and press a button and have their repository turned into a Jekyll site, just to lower the barrier that much more and to get people started, other than typing Jekyll new in a command line, which might be intimidating for some people.
Excellent. question here from Ben Garnder Shepherd. How can we speed up Jekyll compilation, and what makes compilation times lag? I know you did say that speed has improved, but what's in the future for increasing speed?
Yeah, so actually moving to Docker, which we did for security and for user experience reasons, actually became more performant because if you look at the blocker right now is file I/O, is reading in and reading out. If you compile the same Jekyll site on a computer with a physical hard drive and the same site on a computer with an SSD, you'll see things being significantly faster. And then if you put it into Docker, which I don't know the full technical details, but it's more of the site is just kept into memory, you don't have that file lag, so things actually speed up. I don't know that running Docker locally in order to build Jekyll is a good option anytime soon, but there's been some cool discussions around iterative file generation, or around even you can do things around user experience, like maybe we can generate some of the index file first, or if you know I'm going to go to a certain page, generate that first while the rest of the site is kind of built behind the scenes. I think we can do some tweaks. One thing that we talked about, there was an open issue a while back about when I go to hit Jekyll serve me the stale site for a second, and then give me the real page. Because if you're like me, if I'm writing a blog post, I type Jekyll serve, I go to the index of my site, and then I click the blog post. And you don't necessarily need that blog post generated right away. You can kind of leverage that 30-second lag between me clicking, that human lag, in order to build the rest of the site. So I think we can get some human hacks in there, but also iterative, getting smart about what we regenerate. But I think that's a little bit of ways off, but hopefully.
Cool. You said that Jekyll can be has a Zen-like simplicity, and it can be extremely time-saving. Is that a daunting promise to developers and DevOps? Is the promise too large, or for them to comprehend that things could be simpler?
Yeah, I mean, so as you can probably hopefully be able to tell a little bit from my story, I started on the other side of the spectrum. I started on this needs to be really complex. As geeks, we love shiny toys, right? We like using the new fancy framework, and I think the cool thing about Jekyll, and hopefully what the story kind of showed, is it hasn't really changed all that much since its inception, and it doesn't really need to. We've added some things along the edges, but the core promise is the same. We had some discussions with Tom and with Parker about a couple years ago, just kind of thinking through what Jekyll would look like, and I was actually on the wrong side when the conversation started, right? And I wanted Jekyll to do some magic, right? I wanted it to spit all these things out for me and just kind of do all these things behind the scenes. And they really showed me a philosophy of Jekyll should do exactly what the user asks, no more, no less. There shouldn't actually be magic. And I think oftentimes as geeks, as developers, we see the magic, right? We see the shiny object, and we start chasing after building that magic because it sounds cool. But from a user experience, sometimes it's better just to stick to one thing, to do it really well, and to do exactly what the user asks. It helps build expectations, right? Because you put that magic in, then you need to document that magic. Then there's an edge case for that magic, and you need to have an exception to and document the exception. And you keep adding more and more complexity. That sometimes just keeping things simple is a better experience for the user in the end.
Great. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I missed it when you said it, but there was a huge inflection point in Jekyll usage at the start of 2014 in that build graph. Could you just run over what you think caused that again?
In the build graph or in the contribution graph?
Oh, sorry. In the
build graph. Yeah, you're right. Yes.
In the build graph. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was in 1 month in December of 2014 we did the tutorial. I think that was the single largest use because we had all these people that I would just talk to. I would go around government and say, hey, you should use Jekyll, and there wasn't really. I think that was before or right around the time that Jekyll RB launched as the way it currently is. There wasn't really a great starting point for really diving into Jekyll and getting started. And so to have some place where you can go and just lowering the barrier to entry, a lot of people can go click through and pages.github.com, that tutorial was just creating your first Jekyll site. That's all it was, and it was like a multiple choice kind of test, and it just spit out the command line instructions right there, which helped a lot. We also did better help documentation then, and things like the warning messages. It just really there's a confluence of things that really became a better user experience. But if I had to point to one thing, I think, and just based on analytics, it was the tutorial and lowering the barrier to entry. It was also probably, if I remember correctly, right around where Jekyll 1.0 came out, which we put it on our blog. It was, like I said, it was finally a solid product that people could build real things on and not just kind of a geek blogging engine.
Awesome. That is all the time we have questions for. All the time we have for questions. Ben, do you have any parting comments before we move on to our next speaker?
No, I just want to say thanks for having us. I'm a really big fan of Jekyll. It's changed how I look at software development, and it's, if you can't tell from where you are, it's significantly changed the way government publishes policy, publishes data, and I think we're going to start to see that go into other places where maybe companies start pushing their terms of service out under Jekyll so that people can submit pull requests. And I think that's all enabled by treating content as code and making it collaborative. So thank you.
Awesome. Great parting thought there from Ben Balter.